They laughed when it arrived. Then Rommel's crews started dying.
The first American tank didn't announce its arrival with thunder, only with laughter, and the desert learned to regret it. They laughed before the engine ever turned over. British officers leaned against sandbagged walls at the edge of the Libyan desert, arms folded, cigarettes glowing, watching the ungainly American machine roll off the transport truck like a drunk animal finding its legs. German reconnaissance reports would later use harsher words: tin coffin, steel joke, target practice. The tank's silhouette offended every rule the Desert War had taught them. Too tall, too square, rivets visible from half a kilometer away, a gun that looked underfed compared to the long, predatory barrels of German Panzer III's and IV's. Someone no one ever admitted who painted a smiling cartoon face on the turret with whitewash and wrote a name beneath it, Grant's Folly. Inside the tank, Sergeant Daniel Mercer didn't laugh. He felt the vibration of the engine through his boots and into his bones. He smelled hot oil, dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with understanding. Mercer had trained on this machine in Louisiana swamps and Arizona dust bowls. He knew its flaws. He also knew something else the men outside didn't. This tank could take punishment. The Americans called it the M3 Lee. The British, less politely, called it a compromise that no one loved, designed in a hurry, built faster than doctrine could keep up. A 75mm gun bolted awkwardly into the hull instead of a rotating turret, forcing the entire tank to turn to aim. On paper, it looked like a step backward. On the battlefield, paper burned. Across the desert, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the shade of a canvas awning, studying aerial photographs with surgical calm. His Afrika Korps had humiliated British armor again and again. Speed, precision, killing shots from beyond effective return fire. He trusted his crews, and they trusted him. Then the reports began to change. At first, they were dismissed. A burned Panzer here, a crew lost there. Desert warfare was chaotic. Luck always played its part. But patterns emerged, and Rommel was a man who noticed patterns. American tanks. Crude ones. Tall ones. Survivors described something unsettling. Shells that should have killed didn't. Hits that rang and bounced instead of penetrating. A 75mm gun firing high explosive rounds that cracked open pans. Armor at ranges the Germans didn't expect from angles they hadn't planned for. Rommel said nothing aloud. He never did when something worried him. Back at the forward Allied camp, Mercer climbed out of the tank and wiped sweat from his eyes. Lieutenant Harold Finch approached, helmet crooked, grin thin. "They still calling it a coffin?" Finch asked. Mercer shrugged. Coffins don't usually shoot back. Their first engagement came at dawn. The desert was pale blue, the kind of calm that felt like a lie. Mercer's unit rolled forward in a staggered line. Sand crunching under tracks, engines growling like restrained animals. The radio crackled with British chatter, tight, nervous voices already expecting the worst. Then the Panzers appeared, low silhouettes on the horizon. Efficient, confident. The Germans had fought this fight before. They expected another easy lesson. The first shot hit Mercer's tank square in the front plate. The impact was deafening. Metal screamed. Inside, the crew flinched as one. Then nothing. No penetration, no fire, just a ringing vibration and a smear of paint peeled away. "Still with us?" Finch's voice crackled over the radio. Mercer didn't answer. He was already turning the hull, lining up the awkwardly mounted 75mm gun. The gunner adjusted. Breath held, fire. The shell crossed the desert like a delivered verdict. The Panzer erupted, not dramatically, not instantly, but decisively. Armor split. Crew vanished in smoke and sand. Silence followed. Then chaos. German return fire intensified, but something was wrong. Their shots weren't landing the way they should. The American tanks advanced, absorbing punishment, returning it with blunt, brutal force. They weren't elegant. They didn't dance. They endured. By midday, the battlefield belonged to the Americans. Mercer stood atop the tank afterward, staring at the wreckage scattered across the sand. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something colder, understanding. They wouldn't be laughing anymore. That night, Rommel received the after-action reports. He read them slowly, carefully, twice. Losses were higher than expected. Engagement distances had collapsed. His crews had been forced closer than doctrine allowed. He folded the papers and stared into the dark. Adapt, he murmured to no one. The war had just learned a new shape, and it wasn't pretty. The Germans did not retreat because they were beaten. They withdrew because something had gone wrong. Rommel understood the difference, and it irritated him more than defeat ever could. The battlefield reports were now pinned to a wooden board inside his command tent, weighed down at the corners by brass shell casing. Each map was marked with grease pencil American tank sightings circled in red. Not Panzer kills, not British losses, American tanks. Tall silhouettes, hull-mounted guns, crude geometry. The M3 Lee. Rommel tapped the map with a riding crop, eyes narrowing. The British had fielded inferior armor for years, yet now his crews were dying at uncomfortable rates. The desert had not changed. His tactics had not changed, which meant the enemy had. Overconfidence is not a sin, Rommel said quietly to his chief of staff, but refusing to learn is. Across the lines, Sergeant Daniel Mercer cleaned sand from the breech of the 75mm gun with deliberate care. He had stopped counting the dents in the armor after 12. Each mark told a story. Each one ended the same way. Still alive. The men joked less now. Private Alvarez, the loader, had stopped cracking wise entirely. He moved with a precision that bordered on ritual, checking shells, touching the lucky rosary stitched into his sleeve before every engagement. The driver, Collins, spoke only when necessary. Finch's voice over the radio had grown sharper, more clipped. They all felt it. The desert no longer treated them like newcomers. The second engagement came 3 days later. This time, the Germans were waiting. The panzers formed a loose crescent, keeping distance, their long-barreled guns probing from range. Dust plumes marked incoming fire. Shells whistled past or slammed into sand short of the American advance. Long-range harassment, Finch muttered. They were testing us. Mercer watched through the periscope, jaw tight. The M3 was never meant for dueling at distance. Its advantage lay elsewhere: firepower, armor thickness, and an ugly willingness to close ground others feared to cross. They want us to dance, Mercer said. We don't dance. The order came down the line. Advance. The American tank surged forward, engines roaring, tracks biting deep. German fire intensified. One M3 to Mercer's left took a hit to the side armor, buckled but held. Another lost a track, spinning uselessly, smoke curling from the engine compartment. The radio filled with overlapping voices, fear, commands, swearing. Then Mercer saw it. A Panzer III repositioning behind a low ridge, attempting a flanking shot. Clean. Textbook. Deadly. Hard left. Mercer barked. The tank lurched as Collins obeyed. The hull gun came to bear just as the Panzer crested the ridge. The German fired first. The shell struck the M3's frontal armor at an angle, ricocheting upward with a shriek that made Mercer's teeth rattle. "Fire!" he shouted. The 75mm spoke again. The Panzer did not explode. It simply stopped being a tank. The turret jammed. Smoke poured out. A hatch flew open, and a crewman stumbled free, clothes burning, screaming words Mercer did to understand and did to need to. The Germans pulled back shortly after, not routed, not broken. Concerned, that night Rommel paced. His officers argued doctrine, range, ammunition, angles of attack. Someone suggested air support exclusively for American armor. Another proposed night engagements only. Rommel listened, then stopped. They are not better tanks, he said. They are different tanks, and difference kills complacency. He ordered changes immediately. New engagement rules, flanking priority, coordinated anti-tank gun ambushes, use of terrain, patience. The desert, after all, rewarded patience. 2 weeks later the ambush came. Mercer's unit advanced through a shallow wadi at dusk, visibility low, air thick with dust. It felt wrong from the start, too quiet, no probing fire, no distant engines. Then the ground erupted. 88mm shells tore through the air with apocalyptic force. One M3 vanished in a fireball so bright Mercer felt heat through the armor. Another was punched clean through front to back like the tank had been made of paper. 88 seconds. Finch shouted, "Pull back." But pulling back meant turning. And turning meant exposure. Mercer's tank took a hit to the lower glasses. The impact knocked Alvarez off his feet. Warning lights flickered. Smoke filled the compartment. "Still moving," Collins yelled. Mercer forced the tank forward, heart hammering. He knew the M3 could take punishment, but even steel had limits. They broke free under cover of darkness, leaving 3 tanks burning behind them. That night, Mercer sat on the sand, helmet in his hands, staring at the wreckage silhouetted against the stars. The tank wasn't invincible, it never had been. But it had changed the rules. Rommel knew it too. The next phase of the Desert War would not be about superiority, it would be about adaptation, and adaptation always came with a body count. By the 3rd month, the desert no longer treated the American tanks like curiosities, it treated them like predators. Word traveled faster than engines ever could. German crew whispered about the tall American machines that refused to die. British infantry stopped smirking when the M3s rolled past and started stepping closer, walking in their shadows, trusting their bulk the way sailors trusted hulls in rough seas. Sergeant Daniel Mercer felt the shift before anyone said it aloud. Men watched them now, not with laughter, with expectation. That was heavier than mockery ever had been. The M3s had gained nicknames: ugly ones, affectionate ones, desperate ones. Steel Bishop, Desert Hammer, Church with Tracks. The names changed depending on who was speaking, but the meaning didn't. When American armor appeared, something happened. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was death delayed just long enough to matter. Rommel adjusted again. He stopped chasing dramatic breakthroughs and began hunting crews instead. His orders were precise. Isolate American tanks, strip them of infantry support, lure them into terrain that punished height and rewarded concealment. Minefields bloomed like invisible gardens across the sand. Anti-tank guns were buried deeper, camouflaged better. He respected the M3 now, which meant he intended to kill it properly. The trap closed near Bir el Harmat. Mercer's unit advanced under a sky bleached white, heat shimmering off armor so intensely it blurred outlines. The radio carried British reconnaissance chatter, fragmented, uncertain. Enemy movement. Possibly repositioning, possibly wasn't comforting. They entered a shallow basin ringed by rocky rises. It looked defensible. It felt wrong. Mercer didn't like terrain that felt helpful. Hold spacing, he ordered. Eyes on the ridgelines. The first shot came from the right. A flash. A crack. One tank's turret snapped sideways as if struck by a giant's fist. The crew never got out. Then the left erupted. 88 seconds again, but smarter this time. Coordinated. Overlapping fields of fire. The desert itself seemed to spit steel. Reverse, reverse, Finch shouted. Mercer hesitated. Turning back meant exposing weaker armor. Pushing forward meant closing distance, dangerous, suicidal, necessary. Forward, Mercer said. The M3 surged ahead, tracks grinding over rock. A shell struck the hull with a concussive boom, knocking the air from their lungs. Alvarez screamed something half prayer, half curse. They crested the basin's edge and found the guns. German crews scrambled, surprised by the audacity. The 75 millimeters roared at point-blank range. One gun vanished in smoke and debris. Another fired once before being silenced by a second shell. Mercer saw German infantry scatter, saw fear, real fear in disciplined men who weren't used to being rushed by something that should have died already. But the cost was brutal. 2 M3s burned behind them. A third lay crippled, crew bailing out under fire. Collins slumped in his seat, blood running from a cut above his eye. They survived the ambush. Barely. That night, Mercer wrote a letter he never finished. He stared at the paper, trying to explain to someone back home what it felt like to drive a machine everyone thought was a joke until it wasn't. How mockery turned into reliance. How reliance turned into quiet terror every time the engine coughed. He tore the letter up. Some things didn't belong on paper. Across the lines, Rommel reviewed casualty figures with growing intensity. His crews were adapting, but so were the Americans. The M3 was not elegant, but it absorbed mistakes better than German armor ever had. It forgave errors. It let men live long enough to learn. That was dangerous. Rommel issued a final directive: concentrate fire, finish kills, no half measures. If an American tank was engaged, it was to be destroyed beyond doubt. No more bouncing shells. No more survivors. The next battle would test that order. It came at dawn, under low cloud cover that muted the sun and trapped sound close to the ground. Visibility was poor, exactly the kind of conditions Rommel wanted. The Germans struck first. Panzers surged forward, flanked by mobile anti-tank guns, infantry riding hulls. Smoke rounds filled the air, blinding optics. The battlefield collapsed into chaos almost instantly. Mercer's radio screamed with overlapping calls. Tanks on the left hit. We're hit. Drivers down. Mercer forced calm into his voice. Focus. One target at a time. They fired blind, relying on sound and instinct. The M3 shuddered under repeated impacts. Armor plates groaned. Rivets popped loose, becoming lethal shrapnel inside the compartment. Alvarez went down, clutching his shoulder, blood soaking his sleeve. Still breathing, he gasped. That's enough, Mercer said. The smoke thinned just long enough for Mercer to see a Panzer charging directly toward them, muzzle flash blooming. There was no time to turn. No choice, Mercer muttered. Fire anyway. The shell struck low, ripping through the Panzer's side armor. The German tank slewed sideways, crashing into another. Both burned. The battlefield froze for a heartbeat. Then the Germans pulled back. Again. Not in rout. In calculation. When the dust settled, the desert was littered with wrecks from both sides, but something subtle had shifted. German advances were shorter now, their pauses longer. They were thinking, and thinking men could be beaten. Mercer climbed out of the tank after, legs shaking, ears ringing. British infantry approached, eyes wide, hands clapping his shoulders, thanking him in hoarse voices. No jokes, no laughter, only relief. Far away, Rommel stood on a ridge, binoculars lowered. The Americans are learning too quickly, he said quietly. The desert wind carried the smell of smoke and oil between the lines. This war was no longer about speed. It was about survival, and the mocked tank, ugly, awkward, underestimated, was still there. Waiting. The desert had stopped keeping score. No banners were raised. No triumphant communiques were sent back to Cairo or Berlin declaring decisive victory. Instead, the war settled into something far more dangerous: attrition measured in burned metal and missing men, in names crossed off lists that grew longer every week. Sergeant Daniel Mercer felt it in the way mornings began. Less shouting, less bravado, more checking, more silence. His tank had been repaired twice now. field welds scarred across its hull like crude stitches. Someone had repainted the cartoon face on the turret after a shell blast scorched it away. But the smile looked forced now, stretched thin by heat and grime. The name Grant's Folly remained, though no one said it aloud anymore. Not even as a joke. The Americans had learned Rommel's new habits. The Germans had learned theirs. What followed was a deadly conversation carried out in steel and fire, each side answering the other's question with another dead crew. The M3 Lee was no longer mocked. It was anticipated. German gunners waited for it, adjusted for it, feared it just enough to hesitate, and hesitation was lethal in the desert. The next operation was supposed to be routine: support a British infantry push along a shallow ridge, flush out remaining German positions, secure supply lines. Nothing heroic, nothing headline-worthy. Those were the operations that killed the most men. The advance began under a high sun, heat flattening everything beneath it. The sand reflected light so fiercely it felt like staring into a mirror made of fire. Mercer's tank moved steadily, radio quiet except for occasional range calls. Then the ridge erupted. Anti-tank guns opened from concealed positions, staggered and disciplined. Not the thunder of 88 seconds, smaller calibers, faster firing meant to cripple tracks, force immobilization. A tank ahead of Mercer lost mobility instantly, its left track shredded. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. One made it, two didn't. Flank fire incoming, Finch warned. They're trying to pin us. Rommel's fingerprints were all over this. Mercer scanned the ridgeline, calculating angles. He could feel the tank crew watching him, waiting not for orders but for confidence. That was the unspoken burden now. Leadership wasn't about rank. It was about calm. We push, Mercer said. They want us stuck. We don't give them stuck. Collins pushed the engine harder. The M3 climbed the slope, shells striking armor in sharp, metallic bursts. One penetrated the side sponson, wounding Alvarez again. Another clean hole. Another reminder that survival was always conditional. At the crest, Mercer fired point blank into a camouflaged gun pit. Dirt, bodies, and metal flew. The ridge fell silent in seconds that felt unreal. The infantry followed, wide-eyed. Afterward, a British captain approached Mercer, helmet under his arm, voice unsteady. "I've been in this desert since '40, he said. Never seen armor push like that. Mercer didn't reply. Praise felt dangerous, like tempting fate. That night, the men gathered quietly around the tank, sharing water, checking wounds, leaning against warm steel as if it were alive. Someone lit a cigarette and passed it around. Someone else laughed briefly, involuntarily, then stopped, embarrassed. Mercer looked at their faces in the low light. They weren't heroes. They were tired men surviving inside a machine everyone else had underestimated. And somewhere beyond the lines, Rommel studied a new map. The casualty ratios were no longer comfortable. American tanks weren't winning outright, but they weren't dying fast enough either. Each engagement dragged longer, bled more resources, forced pauses where speed once ruled. Speed had been Rommel's religion. Now it faltered. He issued a quiet order: avoid unnecessary engagement with American armor unless conditions were optimal. Strike supply lines instead. Bleed them slowly. It was a smart move. It almost worked. The supply ambush came 2 days later. American fuel trucks burned spectacularly, black smoke pillars visible for miles. Ammunition was rationed, water even more so. Crews waited longer between engagements, engines idling in the heat, men growing irritable and sharp. Morale thinned. That was when stories began. Infantry spoke of tanks that arrived just in time, of M3s appearing through smoke like moving fortresses, of crews who refused to abandon disabled machines, firing until the last shell. Names circulated. Mercer among them, though he never heard it directly. Legends donned, announced themselves. They leak. During a brief lull, Mercer sat alone atop the tank, feet dangling, watching the sun dip low. The desert glowed orange and red, deceptively beautiful. If you are still here with me in this moment, a thought crossed his mind unbidden. Cling to it. And by the way, if you're following this story as closely as we are living it, make sure you stay with us. There's more just ahead. He shook his head, dismissing the odd reflection, and climbed back inside. The war wasn't over. It was sharpening its knife. The next engagement would decide more than territory. It would decide whether the M3 was merely a stubborn anomaly or something that had permanently rewritten the rules. Rommel sensed it. So did Mercer. The desert held its breath. The breaking point arrived without ceremony. No grand offensive. No dramatic radio announcement. Just a shift in pressure so subtle that most men only noticed it when bones began to crack. Rommel had chosen his ground carefully. A wide, open plain bordered by low escarpments, sand firm enough for maneuver but deceptive enough to hide death beneath its skin. He wanted room to trap, room to kill, room to finally end the problem of the American tanks. The M3 had survived because it forced chaos. Rommel intended to remove chaos from the equation. At dawn, German guns were already in place. Sergeant Daniel Mercer felt it the moment his tank rolled forward. The desert felt staged, too still, too empty. Even the wind seemed cautious, as if it knew better than to interfere. Something is wrong, Collins muttered from the driver's seat. Mercer didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the horizon, noting what wasn't there. No probing fire, no distant engine noise, no harassment. Rommel never went quiet unless he was confident. The radio crackled to life. Finch's voice was tight. Multiple contacts, long range, armor and guns. This is it. The German barrage began with precision, not a storm in execution. 88mm shells landed with brutal accuracy, overlapping kill zones carefully measured. One M3 vanished in a pillar of flame. Another was gutted through the turret ring, ammunition cooking off in violent succession. Mercer's tank was hit twice in seconds, armor held but only just. The interior rang like a struck bell. Alvarez screamed as shrapnel tore into his leg. "Stay with me," Mercer shouted, grabbing him. The gunner fired blind, shell after shell, smoke filling the compartment. Collins pushed forward, despite instinct screaming to retreat. This wasn't maneuver warfare. This was slaughter. British tanks began to pull back. Infantry scattered. The battlefield collapsed into fragments of resistance rather than lines. Rommel watched from the escarpment, binoculars steady. He saw American tanks still advancing, still closing distance, still refusing to die. "Concentrate fire," he ordered calmly. "Finish them." German guns obeyed. The M3 to Mercer's right took a direct hit to the hull gun mount. The explosion peeled the front plate outward like a torn lid. No one escaped. Mercer felt something inside him harden, not fear, not rage, but clarity. "Straight at them," he said quietly. Collins looked back, eyes wide. "Sir, straight at them." The tank surged forward, every impact a hammer blow. Rivets snapped loose, flying like bullets inside the compartment. The engine screamed in protest. Smoke filled the air. At 200 meters, Mercer fired. One gun vanished. At 100 meters, another. German crews scrambled, discipline cracking under the impossible sight of a burning, battered tank still advancing. Mercer's tank took its final hit moments later. The shell punched through the side armor, detonating inside. The explosion threw Mercer against the turret wall. The world went white. When sound returned, it was screaming. Alvarez was unconscious. Collins was slumped over the controls, unmoving. Flames licked along the floor. Mercer dragged himself out through the hatch, falling into the sand as the tank burned behind him. He lay there, coughing, staring up at the sky, convinced this was how it ended. Then he heard it. Engines. More American tanks. They were late, but not too late. The follow-on waves smashed into the German positions with ferocity born of desperation and fury. The guns that had slaughtered the first assault were overrun. Panzers were caught repositioning. The battlefield dissolved into close-range chaos, the kind Rommel despised. By dusk, the plain was littered with wrecks, German wrecks. Rommel withdrew that night, not in defeat but in recognition. His losses were unsustainable. For the first time in Africa, his crews were dying faster than replacements could arrive. The mock tank had done this, not through elegance, through refusal. Mercer was evacuated with burns, concussion, and shrapnel wounds. As he was loaded onto a truck, he looked back at the smoking battlefield. The desert was red now, not with flags or triumph, but with consequence. Rommel stood alone under the stars, later silent. The Americans, he said softly, have learned how not to lose. That was worse than losing. The desert did not celebrate. It never did. After the red plain cooled and the fires gutted out, there was no sense of victory, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that settled into every man who survived. The battlefield was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal and the occasional crack of burning fuel. Wrecks lay scattered like carcasses, half buried by drifting sand, almost immediately, as if the desert was already trying to forget. But the men did not forget. Sergeant Daniel Mercer woke 3 days later in a field hospital that smelled of antiseptic and dust. Canvas walls snapped in the wind. His head throbbed with each heartbeat. For a long moment he did not know where he was, or who he still was. Then memory returned in fragments. Fire, heat, the screaming engine. Collins slumped forward, Alvarez bleeding. Mercer sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it. "Easy," a nurse said, pressing him back down. "You're lucky." Mercer almost laughed. "Almost. Where's my crew?" he asked. She hesitated just long enough. "Alvarez is alive. Transferred south. Driver didn't make it." The words landed without drama. That was the cruelty of them. No build-up, no release. Just truth dropped like a stone. Mercer stared at the canvas ceiling until it blurred. Outside the hospital, the war kept moving. Rommel had withdrawn his forward elements and shortened his line, consolidating positions that could be held without bleeding dry. Official reports framed it as tactical adjustment. Unofficially, officers whispered something else. The Americans had become dangerous, not brilliant, not graceful. Dangerous. German tank crews, veterans of Poland, France, the Balkans now spoke of American armor with something close to respect. The tall tanks were still ungainly, still flawed, still vulnerable, but they didn't break easily, and worse, they taught their crews how to survive long enough to learn. Rommel received an intelligence summary 2 days after the battle. It included captured documents, crew interrogations, photographs of destroyed vehicles. He lingered on one image, an M3 Lee, hull torn open, turret scorched black, still angled forward as if mid-charge. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "Machines reflect doctrine," he said later to an aide. And doctrine reflects will. The American doctrine, he now understood, was endurance. Back at the Allied rear, Mercer healed slowly. Burns scabbed over. Shrapnel was removed piece by piece. Sleep came in fits, haunted by the sound of ricocheting shells and the smell of burning oil. One afternoon, a British officer visited him. "You're something of a legend now," the man said awkwardly. Mercer frowned. "Legends don't get their drivers killed." The officer had no reply. The M3 Lee did not survive much longer as a frontline tank. Newer designs were coming, the Sherman, sleeker, more balanced, more in line with evolving doctrine. The M3 had been a bridge, never meant to last, but bridges matter. The men who had crewed the M3 carried its lessons forward, close the distance. When it matters, absorb punishment, keep fighting even when the plan collapses. They took that mindset into new machines, new battles, new continents. And Rommel felt the ripple. Every engagement thereafter cost him more. American armor grew more confident, more coordinated. British units regained momentum. Supply lines strained under constant pressure. The Desert War tipped not suddenly, not spectacularly, but irreversibly. Mercer was reassigned months later, cleared for duty, placed as an instructor. He stood before young tank crews and spoke plainly. "This machine won't save you," he told them. "But it might give you time, and time is everything." He never glorified the M3. He honored it. Rommel, for his part, never dismissed American armor again. In private correspondence, he acknowledged what official propaganda never would: the enemy had adapted faster than expected, and adaptation once learned could not be unlearned. As winter approached, the desert grew colder at night. Fires burned lower. Men spoke more softly. Mockery had died out there. It had been buried under steel. Years later, the desert would look the same. Wind would still comb the sand into endless ripples. Rusted fragments of steel would still surface after storms track linked. Shell casings, shards of armor with edges softened by time. To an untrained eye, they would be indistinguishable from any other battlefield's bones, but to those who had been there, the desert never forgot. Sergeant Daniel Mercer returned once, long after the war had ended. He was older then, thinner. The stiffness in his left shoulder never quite went away, and the scars still itched when the air grew dry. He came not as a soldier, but as a man chasing unfinished thoughts. No uniform, no rank, just memory. The place was unmarked. No monument, no signpost. Just open land and a sky too wide to hold everything that had happened beneath it. Mercer stood where his tank had burned, or where he thought it had burned. The desert rearranged itself over time. Certainty was a luxury memory could no longer afford. He knelt and brushed sand aside until his fingers touched metal warped, corroded, unmistakable. Steel. He closed his eyes. For a long moment, he was back inside the M3 the engine vibrating beneath him. Alvarez's breathing sharp and fast. Collins steady at the controls, doing his job like he always had. The radio crackling with voices that were alive then. The tank everyone mocked. The tank that refused to quit. History books would reduce it to a paragraph, sometimes a footnote. Interim design. Stopgap solution. Outclassed by later models. All of it technically true. All of it incomplete. Because history measured success in outcomes. The desert measured it in survival. The M3 had arrived in Africa at the wrong time, in the wrong shape, with the wrong silhouette. It had violated every lesson the Desert War had taught. Height meant vulnerability. Awkward guns meant inflexibility. Riveted armor meant danger. And yet, it had absorbed punishment meant to kill. It had carried inexperienced crews long enough for them to become veterans. It had forced Rommel's men, some of the best armored crews in the world, to slow down, rethink, and bleed. It had bought time. Time for training. Time for doctrine to evolve. Time for better machines to arrive. Time that men like Mercer and Alvarez lived inside. Rommel understood that before anyone else did. Near the end of the North African campaign, when the tide had already turned, and the outcome was no longer in doubt, Rommel reportedly told an aide something that never made it into official records. "The Americans did not beat us with brilliance," he said. "They beat us with persistence." Rommel himself would leave Africa not long after called back, reassigned, eventually broken by a war that no longer obeyed the rules he mastered. His crews, once so confident, carried the memory of American armor with them into Italy, into Normandy, into a Europe that burned in ways the desert never had. They no longer laughed when American tanks appeared. They prepared. Mercer rose from the sand and wiped his hands on his trousers. He did not salute. He did not pray. He simply stood there until the wind erased his footprints. Alvarez survived the war. He wrote Mercer once, years later, from a small town near San Antonio. Married. 2 children. He worked with engines, though not tanks. Said he missed the clarity of knowing exactly what mattered in a moment. Said he didn't miss the noise. They never spoke of Collins in those letters. Some names didn't need repetition. The M3 Lee faded from frontline service quickly once the Sherman arrived. Sleeker, faster, rotating turret, everything the M3 was not. The war moved on with its new symbols: Normandy hedgerows, Ardennes forests, burning cities instead of burning sand. But the lessons stayed. American armored doctrine hardened around survivability and crew coordination. Training emphasized endurance under fire. Tanks became places men could live long enough to think, not just die fast enough to be brave. That thread could be traced backward, to Africa, to heat and dust, to a tall, awkward tank that embarrassed designers and amused enemies, until it did. Mercer never told his grandchildren much about the war. When they asked, he spoke of heat, of thirst, of long days and longer nights, of fear that didn't announce itself, of machines that rattled and shook and somehow kept going. Once, his grandson asked him why people laughed at the tank. Mercer thought for a long time before answering. Because they thought war was about looking right, he said. Turns out it was about lasting. The desert had taught that lesson brutally, not through speeches, through wreckage. As Mercer walked away, the wind rose, lifting sand into the air. The fragment of steel he had uncovered disappeared again, swallowed by time. Just another buried truth waiting to be found by someone who knew what they were looking at. The American tank everyone mocked did not win the war, but it changed how the war was fought. And in the desert, that was enough, because sometimes history doesn't turn on perfection. Sometimes it turns on the thing that refuses to break, long enough for everything else to catch up.